first. In 3 words, how would you describe Pavlov?
I would describe him as very precise. He was into measurements down to the smallest detail. He was completely dedicated. Even when he didn't have enough money for food, he was still doing his scientific experiments. And he was very patient because he had to go through a lot of very difficult times. In history, the communists took over and he almost lost his lab. That's 3. So there you go.
All right, thanks. That's really good. What did his experiments lead to?
His experiments really led in a direction he never expected. He wasn't a psychologist, but his experiments led to a whole science of psychology. This was really one of the first times that psychology could do something that was very measurable, and it was still psychology. So it paved the way for psychological science.
Were there any ethical conflicts during his time period?
Not for him, but for one of his later followers. I think we'll talk about the little Albert experiment. That was the big ethical problem, but it wasn't Pavlov's problems. It was somebody applying Pavlov's experiments to a person.
Right.
Yeah.
So I guess that leads into the next question. How did Pavlov lead to the little Albert experiment?
John Watson was an American psychologist at the same time, and Pavlov's experiments were translated into English, and Watson read them, and at that time American psychology was trying to establish itself as a science. And so when Watson read Pavlov, he saw there something very scientific, something very measurable, something that they could repeat. And so he thought that conditioning was going to be psychology, and started thinking through how we could get from what Pavlov had established to all these other kinds of psychological phenomena. And that'll probably lead to another question when we talk about some of Watson's work.
Mm-hmm. Did Pavlov inspire any future physiologists or psychologists besides Watson?
Well, he inspired a movement through Watson called behaviorism, which really dominated American psychology, especially from about 1913 to about almost 1960. That if you had taken a psychology class in college in that time period, you would have been told that psychology is the science of behavior, and that everything was about conditioning of one kind or another. And that really all came out of Pavlov's work.
What were the findings or results from his experiments?
The findings, when he worked with his dogs, involved showing that the brain of any creature could form an association or a connection with something else that occurred at about the same time. So he wanted the dogs to salivate, salivate in response to food, but the dogs would start salivating when they heard the footsteps of the person bringing the food. That's what got him thinking about this and testing it. And so he built a number of contraptions and a number of different things, like a bell, like a music box, a light going on and off. These were all paired with or connected with the food in the dog's mind, and so even without the food they would start salivating. And so again, this is the first really scientific kind of psychology that was put on the map. He could turn a behavior on and he could turn it off. And from a scientific perspective, that's the ultimate, that's the gold standard. If you can turn something on and off when you want to, not just when it happens.
Do you have any follow-up questions?
Sorry. What were the results from the little Albert experiment?
There's the ethical part, because Watson wanted to move beyond the dogs, and so he read Pavlov's experiments, thought that he could use the environment to train a child to do or be anything. One side of the ethics was really good. Watson was living at a time when something called eugenics was really popular, which essentially said we want to screen out all the bad genes and screen in all the good genes in our population. Good genes meaning white, middle class, Protestant, and so forth. And so their arguments were based on genetics. You know, everything's about genetics. Intelligence is about genetics, eye color is about genetics, everything else is about genetics. Watson said, no, it's not just about genetics, it's about the environment. And so his little Albert experiments were about proving that it's not all genes. I can change the environment and change the child. The downside, ethically, was that he approached a wet nurse at the university where he worked and essentially asked her to use her baby. You know, she's a single mother, poor, uneducated, and here's an authority figure, white male, coming and asking her this. So she said yes. We don't know how she felt about it, but I can't imagine her saying no. So that's an ethical problem already. He conditioned the child. He said in his journal articles that the child was healthy. Historical studies afterward showed that the child was probably not healthy, and in fact was probably very unhealthy, and the child died not too long after of its medical problems. So that was an ethical problem for Watson. And thirdly, he said that he would decondition fear in the baby once he had conditioned it. So I can turn it on and I can turn it off. There's no evidence that he ever turned it off. He never deconditioned the fear. So the experiment with the white rat was showing the baby, the white rat, banging two metal pipes together really hard and frightening the baby at the same time. There's the connection. The baby now associated the white furry creature with terror, and also it generalized because they showed him other furry things, live and not alive, like a stuffed animal or something, and he showed terror, the same terror, to all of them. Watson said he was also going to turn all that off, or turn the baby back to normal, and there's no evidence that he ever did. He blamed the mother. He said the mother disappeared, we never knew what happened to her, and I couldn't decondition. Well, a scientist has the responsibility there. He needed to make sure he could make that happen, or he shouldn't have started the experiment. So those are some ethical things, some of them positive, you know, that the environment's as important as the genes in many ways, but a whole lot of downsides. The ethical question now is, out of Watson's experiments came all kinds of psychotherapy methods to treat things like terrible phobias, people that have a terrible fear of elevators or heights. And so scientists used Watson's methods to treat things that were really untreatable before. So they used his unethical experiment to make something good happen. And that's an ethical thing that a lot of psychologists have to wrestle with.
We're good.